fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 31, Leave It Well Enough Alone. In his entire life, Lucas had never heard a more absurd use of so many words. Well, that wasn't true. His first boyfriend had once suggested that pineapple on pizza was outrageously disgusting when in fact it was amazing. That relationship was doomed from the start. Of course pineapple belonged on pizza. That sweet, tangy fruit complemented the rich flavors of the cheese and tomato sauce. Besides, anyone who said otherwise was an unwashed heathen. Realizing his mind had spiraled off course, Lucas shook himself back into the moment, turning a dark glare up at his aunt. "I'm sorry, but what? I'm pretty sure I misheard you there." Opelli gripped the boy on his shoulder and spun him around, forcing him to face the long, narrow path he and his party had trampled through. The trees, with their resplendent canopies of crimson and gold, were packed in rows and columns, over 1,000 of them to be precise, and the numerous vines that hung from every branch created a delicate web. "It has been decades since the grove has seen a male dryad, and there are seeds that need pollinating." His aunt had hardly finished the word when Lucas recoiled hard, lurching away from her. "Oh, no, I'm not going to be some sperm donor. You're barking up the wrong tree, lady. Literally." Opelli's eyes grew cold, and she stood to her full height, towering over the man. "You speak as if you have a choice in the matter." "Hey!" Atlas nearly stumbled as he pushed off the mechanical pirate, limping over to plant himself between the two dryads. "The lad said no, and we respect that word around here." His scowl slid smoothly into a winning smirk. "I, on the other hand, am more than willing to offer my services. I am 126 Dryad, after all." Opelli rolled her eyes, using her free hand to push the Arcanist away. "No, you stupid boy. Nothing like that." She used her weapon to gesture at the nearest tree, pointing the tip of her halberd to the vines that strung from the top of the canopy and reached down into the dirt. "Lesser dryads are not born as we are, but grown. This is a forest of potential offspring, stifled by the lack of magic. Male dryads are rare because the groves where they are born don't have enough magic to produce them in large quantities. Magic," she turned back to her nephew, "that you will repay with your blood. Each tree you tend, you will do so with the stolen gift you were born with." "Stolen?" Lucas swallowed, remembering how his bloody nose had caused plants to sprout from the hotel floor. They wanted him to use that to create more dryads. The trees were so close together he could hardly see any distance, and who knew how large the grove was? That would take months, maybe longer. Fear twisted his heart. They would keep him prisoner, or worse, drain him of his blood in one go. "Any child born of Dryad royalty owes their life to the magic of the grove." Opelli's gaze hardened. "Your mother begged the Wild Queen to keep your half-sister from her fate and hid you away from watchful eyes. But she is not here to protect you now, and you will repay that stolen magic to the next generation of soldiers." She pulled in a deep breath through her nose. "War is coming." Outrage boiled away the remaining disbelief that coursed through Lucas, and his fingers clenched into fists at his side. He needed to set a few things straight here. First, my mother didn't do what she did out of love or protection. She was selfish. She abandoned me and my father. Second, I'm not sticking around here when out there is someone I love and just found out he's still alive. His hand gestured off towards the door where the two guards stood stationed. "So, it wasn't nice to meet you. And in this regard, I hope you and my mother are a lot alike, because I hope to never see you again." A bubble of laughter erupted from Opelli, enough that she shook with delight, her head tossed back and eyes shut. After several seconds, her amusement faded, and she returned her hard gaze to the boy before her. "Oh, dear nephew, you have your mother's spunk. I will give you that." She took a single step forward, resting the blunt end of her weapon against the ground. "But as a child of the grove, you must abide the will of its queen." She lifted her halberd up enough to let it fall back to the earth, and a resounding thunk echoed out. A sensation like warm molasses coated Lucas's brain until the sticky sweet nothingness relaxed his body and drew the urge to fight from his muscles and nerves. The bag on his shoulder began to slip, and despite knowing he should catch it, at this moment it didn't really matter. It didn't bother him when the end fell open, spilling out his spare clothes, or when a small wooden box toppled free. "That's better now, isn't it?" A voice spoke to him, and a warmth filled his very soul. He would give it anything. "Yes." The word fell from Lucas's mouth, though his brain hadn't commanded it. "And you will happily comply to my every order?" "Yes." Opelli smiled, a deep and dangerous grin, as she gestured to the grove with the end of her halberd. "There are 1,000 trees that need your magic, boy. They need your blood. Help them." The relief that Undine felt when they had been released without a fight vanished as she watched her half-brother numbly turn towards the forest. "My queen, please!" She rushed forward, gripping his hand to pull him back, but Lucas failed to halt, his fingers simply sliding past hers. She whipped towards her aunt, tears burning at the edges of her vision. "If you want a prisoner, take me. Let him go." "I gave you a chance to flee, Armbreaker, but you forget yourself." A sneer twisted Opelli's features as she hefted her weapon into the air, only a few inches off the ground. "Now I will take you for the grove as well." She let the blunt end slam down once more, and used her free hand to gesture at the Arcanist and his shiny golem. "But first, see to it your friends are escorted from the castle." As Undine slumped in on herself, then turned towards him, Atlas began to fidget on the spot. "Okay, think. He had only experienced magical exhaustion once before, and given that everything around him had turned to utter shite in less than a minute, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. He tapped his knuckles against his forehead, hoping to knock a clever idea from his brain. And then, remarkably, one came to him. It wasn't clever, but it was an idea. "Stay back! I'm a powerful Arcanist, and you don't want to see me angry." Opelli scoffed, looking the pathetic human up and down. "You trespass into my home, and then dare to threaten me? Perhaps I will have you fed to the carnivorous plants instead." He started snapping his fingers repeatedly, sparks erupting from the ends like he was striking a flintstone, but his well of magic was beyond tapped. Okay, so Atlas was without the bulk of his get-out-of-sticky-situations kit, but if there was one thing he was good at, it was bluffing. He focused all the remainder of his magic, encouraging it into a pool in the palm of his hand. He opened it to reveal the smallest fireball of his life. A struck match would burn brighter than this. A smile spread over his features as a sputtering flame warmed his skin. "All right, ladies." He whirled around, that grin widening as he stared down the Sovereign Queen and her wife. "I came here purely by accident, I assure you, with my friends. I will be leaving with them." He held out that tiny, flickering fire. "All of them. Or so help me,
I will ignite this nursery without a second thought.
He'd be more than surprised if this small flame could do much of anything, but Atlas kept that information to himself. The tremor of fear running up his spine was silenced when the robot rolled up beside him, drawing his plunger sword.
Aye, what the Commodore said. All the friends, and all the rum.
Opelli let out another burst of cackling laughter.
With that, you couldn't hope to burn a letter with that flame.
Narrowing his one eye at the Queen's laughter, Atlas took one step towards the nearest tree and gestured at its base.
An Arcanist's flame can burn hotter than the sun. A single ember would rage through a forest in mere minutes.
Ha! He was so good at bluffing. None of what he said was true, but, again, she didn't need to know that. The laughter in her throat was replaced by a low, angry growl as Opelli's posture stiffened. She flexed her wrist, aiming the shining end of her halberd toward the Arcanist.
Gods, prepare the chamber. Death is too good for one such as this.
She took a step forward, and then another. Atlas started to stutter a reply, but it was cut short as he reacted on instinct and dove to the side, dodging the incoming slice of the Sovereign Queen's weapon, one that surely would have cleaved him in two. He ducked, feeling the swish of the blade overhead, and swallowed hard. He rolled away, closing his fingers around his tiny fireball, protecting it from the rush of wind from the sudden movement.
Now, see here!
He clambered to his feet, his body performing an agile, though completely unintentional, pirouette.
I'm not playing around. I will eat.
The blade from the halberd nearly chopped into his favorite neck, his own, but an incoming parry from Bram knocked it aside.
Have at thee, ye scabby seabass.
With a swift chop, the robot's sword fell in two. Opelli planted a heel in his metal chest and sent the machine tumbling to the side as she continued her advance on the Arcanist. Atlas ducked again, backpedaling until he put several feet of distance between them, and he aimed his hand down at the brush at the base of the tree his back was pressed against.
I won't ask again. Let us all leave, or we'll escape while you're putting out the flames.
The quiver in his voice betrayed his bravado as false. But he was tired of the fighting, tired of the constant delays one after another. His best friend was out there, and nothing, not even this trumped-up rutabaga, would keep him from the life he was owed. The Sovereign Queen ignored his words, letting out a feral scream as she charged. Despite his threats, Atlas knew this tiny fire couldn't do what he boasted. He tried to backpedal again, but tripped over a root and fell flat on his rump, pain shooting up through his spine. The flame snuffed out, taking with it their last shred of hope. He threw an open palm towards the angry dryad, hoping the bluff might buy him a few extra moments. He clenched his eyes shut, hoping, praying to his buxom goddesses for something to save him. And for the first time, his prayers were answered. Before the Sovereign Queen could bring her halberd down, a swirling portal opened up in the ground just beneath her feet. The Sovereign Queen managed a look of surprise as she plummeted downwards, her eyes wide with annoyed disbelief. There was barely a scream as it snapped shut with only a small plume of dust to show it ever existed. Atlas pulled back his free hand and turned it over, staring at his palm in shock. Holy hell! He was even more amazing than he realized. His attention snapped back to his friends to find the pair of them frozen in their steps, but their faces still blank. He whipped to the robot.
Grab Ondine. I'll get Lucas. Let's get the hell out of here before she comes back.
Liliana had launched herself from the dais, falling to her knees at the spot where Opelli had vanished, her fingers searching the grass and dirt.
What have you done?
Tears poured down her cheeks.
Guards! Guards!
He didn't give himself a second to think as Atlas scrabbled to his feet and dashed toward his friend. He doubled over to shove the spilled contents back into the bag and threw it over his own shoulder. He then grabbed the Dryad by the waist and hoisted Lucas up like a sack of potatoes, staggering a little beneath his weight. With a shaky first step, Atlas began to stumble walk away from the screaming woman, leading Bram and Undine back the way they had come. But the thunderous sounds of boots clamoring, armor clanking, and swords unsheathing filled the nursery. All around him, guards began to circle, weapons raised. He could bluff his way past one distracted queen, but an army? Sweat began to bead on Atlas's brow as several dozen soldiers closed in around them. With a grunt, he unceremoniously dropped Lucas to the ground. He flexed his palm, open, then closed, several times, attempting to push the small remainder of magic back into his hand. A spark flickered from his fingertips before an even smaller ball of flame than before was birthed into being. If the last one could hardly threaten an envelope, this little guy here wouldn't even make a candle sweat. Well, he'd have to use what he got. Atlas held out that hand, showcasing the fireball as he spun slowly at the dryads before him. They halted, several of them even backing up in uncertainty. Not that the flame looked like it would hurt them, but they still had no idea what was going on.
I said we're leaving, all of us.
These intruders have magicked away your queen.
Liliana let out a strangled cry, pulling out grasses and wildflowers in her clenched fists as she stood.
Kill the human and the mental creature. The other two belong to the grove.
Oh, hell,
Atlas thought, as he aimed that tiny flame at the nearest guard and sent it flying. It didn't erupt in smoke in her face like he wanted, or dissolve into nothing halfway there like he feared, but landed on the very hem of her tabard and began to smolder. The guard paused, looking down at the ember, and started to chuckle, a witty response on the tip of her tongue. Then something slammed into her face, and a caustic liquid doused her.
Drinks on me, or rather, on you.
Wide-eyed, Atlas watched as the bottle of rum caused the flame to take root and the soldier erupted like, well, a piece of wood drenched in alcohol and set on fire. She screamed, dropping her sword and flailing her hands in the air. Several other guards moved to help her, tackling her to the ground to help stomp out the flames, while others began to charge, weapons raised. Atlas's life began to flash before his eyes when a sensation of falling overtook him. The telltale pressure of a portal engulfed them, and before he could figure out how he had summoned one, they impacted a very hard, very unforgiving marble floor. The wind knocked from his lungs. Atlas could only lay there, staring up at a rafter draped in silk, and lament that their escape had happened so quickly he hadn't yet been able to see some of the best moments of his life flash before him.
Everyone all right?
Lucas's horns clacked against stone, and he was snapped from his mindless state.
Whoza!
He sat up quickly, wincing at the new, throbbing pain in his head. Was it from the mind control or the hard impact? He wasn't sure. But at least they weren't still in that nursery. They were sitting in the middle of a polished ivory throne room. Undine and Bram groaned in unison as they helped each other off the floor, the robot lamenting about the
bloody waste of rum.
As he climbed to his own feet, brain still rattled, Lucas was struck by the beauty of the room they had landed in. A dozen columns supported an impossibly tall ceiling, each streaked with green malachite and traced with silver. Sparkling sapphires twinkled in the light that spilled from the mosaic windows. Long, tall green banners bearing the emblem of a winged snake and a sun motif hung between every column. He followed them along the walls until his eyes landed on the largest one, positioned behind a tall-backed marble throne in ivory and silver. So gaudy, and that was saying something because he was caught up on all the popular fantasy TV shows back home. There were long branches of silver that folded down over the top of the throne, transforming into feathers and wings the farther down they went. In fact, there were so many feathers, so many branching wings, he couldn't be certain this wasn't some ancient biblical beast. But then his eyes landed on the figure that sat in the chair, and he froze. Lucas had seen a great deal of curious things since stepping out of his door at the end of summer. Creatures of lore, gods and demigods, talking plants, even several cryptids. But nothing unsettled him more than this. Where? One of the Dryad guards had been sucked in with them, and she pulled herself off the floor, shaking away her own dazed confusion. Slow understanding sank in, and she grappled for her sword, raising it towards the figure on the throne. You have no right to interfere in our domain. The Sovereign Queen will... Lucas watched as the woman, for that's what she was, waved a lazy hand, and another portal snapped open beneath the guard, and only the guard, whisking her away with a short cry of surprise. He swallowed as he grabbed hold of his sister's arm, pulling her closer. Where are we? I can answer that question, young man. The woman stood, descending the few steps off the raised dais and onto a deep purple runner. Several attending creatures attempted to help her, but she snapped her fingers at them angrily, and they returned to their solitary positions. Undine, more versed with the realms on this side of the mountains, gasped. The figures that stood before each column were composed of ornately carved fragments of wood and bone, each wrapped in vine or gossamer fabric. A blue light emanated from within their amalgam bodies. Those are the Life Wardens, Wicker Witches. But how was they here? What's that? Lucas's attention was drawn back to the woman that marched closer to them. He realized now that 4 of the wings he thought to be part of the throne were attached to her back. One set was tinged with teal, the others indigo. A tail with matching colored feathers swished along the ground behind her. She was not some dainty queen, no. Her power practically radiated off her, like the moments before a terrible storm rolled in. It was electrifying. Her body, strong and muscular, covered in hard-won scars and showcased by the flowing tunic and armor of a warrior. Her hair cut short above her long ears, practical and the gray of early morning fog. His focus faltered when Lucas's attention landed on her face. Her eyes were 2 different colors. No, not just that, but 2 different shapes entirely. One was typical, what he'd consider normal, with a dark iris in its middle and framed by purple. But the other one looked like it rather belonged on a serpent, large and yellow with a vertical black slit. I do not know where we are, dear brother, Undine hissed down at the man clamped tightly around her arm. You are in the Hall of the Wild Queen, and I am her. She bowed, short and curt, setting her staff against the floor where the clink echoed out. My name is Auxilia, Avatar of Tiara, Warrior Queen of the Enshrined Wilds. And, as amusing as it was to watch you flounder about in the Dryad Groves, I needed to have you here for what is to come. Lucas didn't like the ominous ring to those words, and he swallowed hard. And, what is to come? Auxilia smiled. Your companions will be joining you any moment now. Let's wait for them, shall we? Darkness choked his vision, and Eric wondered if this was death. A shiver ran through him, from cold or fear he didn't know. Then something caught his attention. Distant voices, other lost souls the gods had condemned. He took a shaky breath and raised his head. Hello? The world around him blinked into existence with a brilliant flash. Stars and galaxies whirled around him, zooming through the void and whizzing past his ears. He rubbed at his eyes, taking in the glory and horror of Kadaiani's celestial chamber. He stumbled back a step as a rumbling overtook the traveling cosmic bodies, pulling him from his reverie. A crystalline table, larger than anything Eric had ever seen, coalesced out of the swirling pools of stardust at his feet. At the head of the table, a podium appeared, sparkling with its own cosmic energy. A courtroom, one that would decide his fate. At the center of the table sat the black, lightless orb that swirled with the event horizon of billions of stars being pulled in, ripped apart, and swallowed in its hungry maw. And as the hypnotic carnage played out, Eric let the harsh reality sink in. That was his final destination. To spend eternity being pulled apart one atom at a time and compressed beneath unfathomable gravitational force. A singularity. Something slammed into the table, shaking the universe and causing several galaxies to spiral off kilter. He turned to see a constellation of stars forming a gargantuan stag with 6 legs, 2 of which were withered and shrunken. The animal reared back its head, letting out a breath that formed into a plume of stardust.
This is a farce. There should be no trial. Kill him and be done with it.
Though the animal's mouth never moved, Obus's angry voice wheezed across the dark expanse. Eric's gaze swung, traveling over the table that could comfortably fit edge to edge inside a coliseum. Creatures formed of stars and nebulas, each one a celestial avatar of the various gods he had besought. Lyra, in the form of a woolly Shetland pony, rolled her eyes and tossed her head back at the god of death.
What, and forgo the chance to experience that winning personality of yours?
She kicked a stray star at him like a crumb.
Fat chance, dear boy.
When the goddess of minor mischief chuckled at her own joke, Obus reared back with a roar.
Please.
Kadaiani, the only one of the 6 that was in her flesh and blood form, her human one to be exact. She stood behind the podium, larger than it, the table, or the other gods. She glanced around at all of them, using her sharp gaze to gain their attention.
Now that we are all here, we can begin.
He had brought this on himself, but Eric realized that didn't make this moment any easier. He swallowed hard as he steeled his nerves. 2 yeses, 2 nos, and 1 forfeit. Terror ebbed into his senses as his eyes flickered toward the black hole at the center of the table. He was doomed. A tiny, celestial-coated magpie fluttered down onto the table, hopping a few paces towards the giant podium. Rumis clacked his beak, bobbing his head as he faced the others.
I vote we let the boy live. He has shown moral fortitude.
With a stomp of her hooves, Lyra nodded.
Agreed. He's a bit of a know-it-all, but I liked him.
It does not matter if we like him.
Obus gnashed his teeth as he tossed his head in the elf's direction.
He is a threat, a catalyst that could destroy everything.
From the tortoise-shaped lump of stars, Arkesh spoke, nebular vapor rising from its shell and nostrils.
Obus is correct. Logic dictates he cannot handle the task with acceptable accuracy.
Eric leaned his head back, nodding slightly in defeat. But relief washed over him instead of fear. He was glad this was over, wasn't he? That timelines and realities would be safe from his own miscalculations. Perhaps that was just his brain rationalizing his final moments. And you, Isin. Godiany looked at Eric. What say you? Blinking in confusion when all eyes turned on him, Eric glanced over his shoulder, spinning around once to see there was nothing other than stars and galaxies behind him. Then something rustled from beneath the fur collar of his bomber's jacket, and a tiny mouse jumped down. Instinctually, he held out his hands to catch the creature, and it landed expertly in his palms.
Yes, he is mortal, and fallible. Very, very fallible.
The voice that came from the creature wasn't what Eric was expecting. It was androgynous, measured, and commanded respect from anyone that listened to them.
He will make mistakes,
Isin continued.
and, as Obus claims, he may be a catalyst, but that does not make him evil.
Jaw-dropping, Eric could only watch on with amusement as the tiny mouse leapt from his hand and grew, pulling in more stars and gases until it stood human-shaped and sized and took their place next to Godiany.
However, when he believed himself free of our oversight, he chose, of his own volition, to leave the timeline intact and called upon us to place judgment. I believe he has realized the danger he poses and can be trusted not to abuse his power. We should allow him to continue living.
Another angry roar erupted from Obus, his body blurring at the edges as he slammed his hooves against the table and shouted in protest. But Eric didn't hear them. His fingers tingled, and he let out a tense breath that relaxed the muscles in his chest. He had won. He was free. Free to keep wreaking havoc on the lives of others. Free to meddle with reality over and over until it unraveled. Free to continue fixing things and people in the same way. Eric's eyes snapped up.
Obus is right.
The death god stopped mid-tirade, turning the rotten half of his face towards the little creature, clearly having misheard him.
What trickery is this?
No trickery, Eric sighed.
I'm exhausted, and I can't keep doing this. Every time I try to make things better, inevitably it gets worse. Even before all this.
He waved his blackened hands around the cosmic courtroom.
15 years ago, I went out to bring my dad home, and I nearly got my brother killed. I tried to save Ebra from the Brotherhood, and ended up waking Rivaria in the process.
The other gods turned wary looks on Obus at that, but Eric continued.
I can't help myself. If I see a problem, I have to fix it. Consequences be damned. I need to be stopped.
His shoulders relaxed, the weight he carried on them slipping at last. He focused his gaze on the black orb once more.
Please, just make it stop.
The silence was thick, like the actual vacuum of space, but he could see it in their body language. They understood and would grant him his wish. Eric almost felt the pull of a smile on his face. Almost.
I have something to say.
An unknown voice reverberated from the orb, causing ripples to disturb the universe and galaxies around them. Something ancient in him urged Eric to flee, and he took a terrified step back. Kadiani scowled. You are no longer part of this council, Hunger.
I may not get a vote, but in a matter such as this, would my counsel not be wise?
Obus bobbed his massive antlers.
Let the Primal One speak.
Releasing an agitated sigh, Kadiani waved her hand towards the black orb, and it began to vibrate. A beam of stardust and light shot out of the black hole as the energy that held it in its previous form began to dissipate, creating a thick vapor cloud in angry oranges and browns. Then, following the beam of light, something slithered free. Eric jumped back as he watched a celestial creature swim through the air above all their heads. But unlike the others, who were all pure starlight, this god was inky black, with orange and gold vapor swirling along its serpentine body.
What difference does it make if this one is worthy or not? If he is our savior or our undoing?
With a start, Eric realized he was staring at a cosmic oarfish. Its dorsal fin and crest were made from stars that undulated along its ribbon-thin body as it swam between the gods. It paused long enough to cast him a glance with a terrifying, glassy black eye. The fish moved back towards the others on the table as it spoke.
You all talk as if we have a choice in the matter. We do not.
Kadiani frowned. Speak clearly, outcast, or speak not at all.
As you wish, Water Mother.
Hunger put on a burst of speed, his head coming to a stop beside Obus.
He claims to have woken Ravaria, but she still sleeps, no? I sense her.
The death god released a snort.
Far to the south. Dormant. And yet he reeks of her magic. How could that be?
The oarfish continued his slow circling of the group.
How could this be? Unless...
Isin realized it first, their heads snapping towards Eric in shock.
What happened before you arrived on our shores?
Nearly collapsing under the weight of all eyes on him, Eric stumbled back another step. He was now a good 3 strides from the table. You mean before Indiga found me? He shrugged when the others nodded. He wasn't exactly proud of the story, and was hesitant to share it even now.
Well, Elias and I were trying to open a portal to rescue my brother, but that caused a...
Elias. Kadiani quirked a brow. Elias Folkgrave, Zelfir's son. Eric nodded. The goddess's frown deepened. How could an infant help you open a portal? An infant? No, he hadn't heard that right.
What do you mean, infant? He's been king for 50-some-odd years?
A haunting laughter echoed out across the pitch and stars, rattling the celestial bodies and causing the blood in Eric's veins to run frigid.
This, my friends, is the problem.
Hunger chuckled, gleeful malice laced in his words.
This is our present, but his past. If you kill him now, does that not change the timeline? Surely it would unravel your precious web.
Above the squawk of responses, Arkesh released a hiss of steam and stars.
We cannot know.
Pinching the bridge of his nose, Eric grumbled under his breath. He had a sudden memory of the portal that had saved him after Alpha had thrown him from the tower. It had been red, just like the ones he created now. If I'm in the past, why not just zap me forward?
They cannot.
Hunger's laughter rumbled the galaxies once more as he began to entwine his long, sinewy body around the elf.
The past has already happened, but the future, not so. Not for us.
Eric shied away from the god that was attempting to constrict him, uncomfortable with the chilling sensation. He managed to wriggle free and leaned over, placing his hands on the massive table before him. But every time you sent me to the past, you brought me back and fixed the changes. What's the difference now? Godiany placed a hand on her stomach, swallowing down the bile in her throat. We were the anchor points to this present, but you have none to return to. She closed her eyes for a long moment before glancing at all the other gods around the room and then downed the elf. Hunger speaks true. We have no choice but to let you reach your present the old-fashioned way. Huh? A sinister chuckle emanated from the center of the table, where Hunger was pulling himself back into his tiny prison.
And you are gonna have to make sure you arrive without unraveling that web.
Eric paled. Only he knew how things were supposed to play out for the next half a century. The things that had to change, and the things that had to be left well enough alone. Any one wrong move could potentially set off a chain reaction of catastrophic proportions. Their one slim chance was that he, a neurodivergent egomaniac with an IQ of 152, would spend the next 50 years policing the course of events. Eric swallowed hard. We are all doomed. You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
It was just a coincidence.
Heck of a coincidence, if you ask me.
I'm just saying, someone has to come up with these superstitions in the first place, right?
I suppose, yeah.
Then they can't be real. Otherwise, I could say something like, I don't know, don't snap a twig. Or something terrible will rain down upon you.
Huh. I hadn't thought about it that way. I suppose you have a...
Oh, not again. Oh, gosh.
Are you all right?
Who are you? What is this place? How did I get here?
Oh, my gods. You summoned the Sovereign Queen herself.
You did this.
Of course not, your ladyship.
Well, you did.
Shut your yap.
Explain, now, or I shall snap your necks like this twig.
Oh, I wouldn't have done that.
Done what? What in the name of...
All right, I'm convinced.
Maybe we should leave before they wake up.
Yeah, good idea.